Welcome to week 10, everybody. Brain, Culture and Society, part 2. We will continue the discussion we began last week on chapter 5, and we will venture into a more profound understanding of the fields that we briefly introduced in the first part of chapter 5, so transcultural psychiatry, transpersonal psychology, social and behavioral neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, and pretty much the link between the person and the community, the person and society, the singular individual basis of understanding and the context base of existence. Fantastic. So let's begin with a general overview of these topics, and then we will utilize some slides and some diagrams to make each topic more clear and easy to understand. Now, transcultural, cross-cultural, folk, ethno-ethnic based, anthropological, sociological, sociobiological, all of these terms assume that it is not enough to focus on the single person at any given specific time and space. This really goes back to week 1 and 2 and our continuous discussion on space and time. We very briefly, very superficially mentioned qualia, field theory, especially field theory of consciousness, quantum mechanics, and the idea of the presence and interaction across space and time is still very much relevant in this week. Now, this is also one of the most, I would say, holistically empathetic parts of this course, because it attempts to separate evidence-based science from interpretation, not because the first one is less important than the second one, but because the first one has to be interpreted in order to function in the world, in order to provide solid ways to utilize it in an everyday situation. So by transcultural and cross-cultural, first of all, we assume that there are indeed different cultures. There are indeed different cultural frameworks according to which medicine is judged. For instance, since we're talking about neuroscience, one of the areas where this is extremely relevant is psychiatry and psychology. What is perceived as a disease, illness, or disorder, or an issue in certain cultural frameworks might not be interpreted as such in other cultural frameworks. And there are plenty of examples in this context. Think about the role of possession, the role of spells, the role of feeling that we are out of control because something else is inside of us, okay? And the easiness according to which certain branches of more materialist psychiatric model disregard this as only pathological of psychotic nature. This is just an example, of course, but it's also true for the way we interpret pain. Since pain, we mentioned, it's a non-thing in itself, it doesn't exist in itself, but it has to do with perception on an individual level, then you might wonder, rightfully so, whether this is also influenced by society as well as community. Now, I would say that one of the main differences between society and community is the much more profound balance of the term community in comparison to society, at least in the way the latter is interpreted nowadays. So cum munus, these shared elements of communitas, right? As opposed to societas, or societas, depending which pronunciation you want to use. And the fact that there is a connection between ethnos and ethos, the connection between interpretation of reality on a single individual level and the level of this concentric modality. One of the researchers that I like to mention from time to time, of course, is Uri Bronfenbrenner. When you think about this ecological model of existence, or Larry Shelton here at UVM, the deep ecological model, okay, in the context of psychology, and how everything interacts. Now, for instance, let's see how our perception on a brain level and on a mind level plays such an important role in the way we interpret the world. Now, next week we will talk about theory of perception and cognition. And again, this will be a very, very complex series of topics. But for now, let's just take a look at the way the brain plays a role in understanding the connection between labels, for instance. Let's think about the perspective of diversity, okay? Critical theory, racial theory, critical race theory, and the assumption, whether valid or not, we'll talk about that, that phenotype plays a much bigger role than genotype in the way we are judged. Now, of course, since phenotype by definition is predicated upon externally recognizable factor in terms of aesthetic, in terms of visual perception, then it will make sense that this will be our business card when we present ourselves to the world. Our external apparatus is the first thing that we encounter, given the possibilities of utilizing all our senses. Of course, if there's any impairment on the level of the visual cortex, of course this might not be the case, but otherwise the way we appear, appears to provide evidence for the truth. Now, etymologically speaking, this is not surprising. Think about the Germanic term shine, in German scheinen, or shine in English, where appears, it also appears to be truth, It's shined. You can use this for the sun is shining, or it's shined as in it appears to be true. There's a level of sparkling truth that pops up from this term. It's this brilliance, this evidence, something that you can see, right? Evidence, again, etymologically speaking, something that appears to you, that you can see ex video in Latin. So it is not surprising that we are judgmental in the way we appear. And it's also not surprising that what appears to be different than us might constitute a problem that, if not well understood, creates fear, anxiety, hatred, anger, judgment, rejection, and a variety of other things that we definitely have to assess in our society. Now, of course, this is also predicated on the culture itself. For instance, one of the false assumptions is to utilize current parameters for judgment and just apply them as they are 500 years ago, 5,000 years ago. So, for instance, just to give an example, to claim that, I don't know, a random citizen of the Roman Empire would perceive race as predicated on skin color, as intrinsically different, might be actually quite mistaken, given the fact that emperors were white in the current sense of the term, but none of them were. Think about Scipiones Africanus, to give you an example, and the fact that Roman citizenship made much more of a distinction between, let's use the term, A-level people versus B-level people than in skin color, to give an example. And so even terms such as East and West might be socially constructed only in a specific time and space. For instance, the United States tend to refer to themselves as Western culture, and in that sense they will also incorporate European culture, where in many cases Europe, maybe due to an ethnocentric perspective, might consider itself as central, and the United States only as Westerner, as opposed to Easterner from the Ural Mountains on. But it's also true that if you compare East and West, then by Western civilization, you will not be mistaken in thinking about Rome and Greece. So there's a lot of overlapping magisteria. Another term, American. What does it mean to be American? Well, in the United States, interestingly enough, I always find this quite interesting. American means a citizen of the United States, where outside, at least in the way I was brought up, American simply means someone from the continent. So if you think about the question would be, what is the biggest city in America? The three biggest cities: Sao Paulo, Mexico City, and Lima. None of them are, of course, in the United States. So to think of the biggest American city, you don't think of the United States, to give an example, right? What is the biggest North American city? Well, of course, Mexico City. Wait, is Mexico in America? Well, of course it is. And the fact that the term American appears to be identifiable only with the United States is quite surprising. I'm personally a football fan, football in the British sense of the term, so a soccer fan. And so when we think about the American Cup, we always think about soccer, okay? And the Copa America, by definition, has only so much in common with the culture of the United States, just to give an example. Or other factors that the term America in itself did not at first, as it's obviously known, denote the United States alone. In fact, it was more towards Central America, and the term itself, of course, has to do with the quote-unquote discoverer, Amerigo Vespucci. And the term Amerigo, despite the fact of being a very common Italian name, at least during the Renaissance, is in itself a Germanic name from Emmerich, right? So these are just a few examples of how things can be reconstructed. Another term on top of my mind is the term Latino, okay? Where in Europe, I always refer to Latino as Western culture, as Rome, the Latins, the Roman Empire, versus Latino, Latina, Latinas in this part of the world has to do with a Hispanic / Spanish-based culture, or at least Hispanoformic culture, or at least Romance part of the culture, if you want to include Spanish-speaking population as well as Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese population. So the very terms that we utilize are somewhat mistaken. I can give you many other examples. For instance, the way endonyms and exonyms are utilized. Example, the term Welsh, okay, the term Welsh as the foreigner, right? This is very, very commonly utilized when we talk about the history of the United Kingdom and the history of Wales, where the newcomers, whether you want to view them as conquerors or new settlers, were of a Germanic stock, of course, and view the locals, the natives, the autochthonous, aboriginal culture, which was, of course, a Celto-Italic culture. They were Celts, of course, of a Gaelic culture. They look at them as foreigners, as different from us, people that they will use a different language, so therefore Welsh. And the term is found throughout the Germanic world, for instance, in regard to Roman-speaking population or Celtic Gaelic-speaking population, Welsh, Welsh, Volsch, okay, this is true for Switzerland, for Italy, to some very minute extent to the Slavic culture as well. In Poland, for instance, the term for Italian or Italy is also a cognate of Welsh, Włocka, for instance. And other terms, of course, have to do with the opposite, how people that were speaking, for instance, Romance language view Germanic tribes, and the classical example for them were Barbaros, right, or barbarians, because of the way they would pronounce Greco-Roman languages, okay? And of course that in turn took on a negative connotation even in Germanic languages, okay? Or the definition based on the lack of ability to speak a language, okay? So Niemiec, Niemcy, Niemczka, Niemieczka in Slavic languages to define Germanic tribes. So people that were not able to speak the Slovo as Slavs, okay, as the Slavic kin, that were speaking a different language. Or, interesting enough, you might find examples of a mutual connotation where things kind of are hybrid. Think about certain phenotypical elements in the appearance of fair skin and fair hair in the exonym Finland, for instance, as opposed to Suomi, Suomalainen, right, in the Ugro-Finnic languages, or the way the rest of the Scandinavian area, especially Sweden, was perceived to be more Easterner by the very people we just mentioned, by the Finns. And so you have terms such as Ruotsi, for instance, for Swedes, as opposed to Rus, that has to do with Kievan Rus, and of course the earliest settlement in the Slavic Russian counterpart. There are tons of examples like that. Of course, if you want to go back to Welsh, another term that's connected to this Roman-speaking population is Valach, Valakia, Valach, that very often identify either Romans or Roman-speaking population, and therefore Romania in the Eastern Balkan area, or a population that was different than the otherness, so either Christians as opposed to local Sunni Ottomans Islamic culture, or the difference between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about transcultural and cross-cultural, we have to keep in mind that everything that we just mentioned is indeed predicated on time and space. So there's always a risk in pushing either to say an agenda, despite the fact you might come from a very good place in your heart. You want to understand the complexity of the world using a structure that in itself is universal across time and space. We have, you can make the claim, we have exactly the same brain nowadays as we had in the 1400s, as we had in the 800s. Either to say that we had in the thousands, and so on and so forth. Now, this is a big assumption, of course, that might not be necessarily true, because the brain itself changes constantly, and I would also argue that there are some elements of cognitive laziness, could we use this term, that are predicated upon the evolution of scientific technologies. Okay, so for instance, just to mention a few examples here, there are a lot of myths connected to the birth of the alphabets throughout the world. Think about the Egyptian hieroglyphs, all the way to the runes in the Germanic world. So despite the fact that many would agree that the Elder Futhark or the runic and Rhetoric alphabet were in themselves evolution of either a Phoenician alphabet or an Etruscan alphabet. So this hybrid between pre-Indo-European culture and the new settlers in the Italic Peninsula, all the way to the alphabet, or rather the abjads in the Semitic culture. So there's always a mysticism related to the way the alphabet works, and some fear, you could say, despite of the fact that this might be our modern interpretation. We in the modern world are, in my mind, a little bit snobbish, a little bit arrogant in thinking about all generation past as, well, a little more gullible, a little more naive. They didn't really know what to do. They just believed that, I know, Zeus would just throw at them, I don't know, a storm, and because they didn't really understand the science. But now we are very, very smart, and therefore it doesn't make sense to say that we stand on the shoulders of giants that were just, naive, and there was pretty much nothing to discuss of scientific relevance before the Age of Enlightenment. I assume this to be a quite arrogant and anti-historical perspective, and really not solid, scientifically speaking. Nevertheless, there is this amelioration, improvement on one side, where alphabet allowed us to write things down. Think about the Romans, right? Scripta manen, so what's written will remain, right? Verba volant, instead. Verba volant, scripta manen. What's spoken language, what's said just disappears, that it flies away, and what's written, it will remain. So that there is something that produces knowledge. Think about our ability to create meta-analysis, for instance, to read each other's peer-reviewed scientific research, right? But then, of course, the more you write, the less memory you use at first, because you don't have to memorize things. So all cultures that were orally transmitted tend to be, I wouldn't say disappearing, but they were morphing. Okay? And this is especially true in the context of religious literature, for instance, poetic literature, where there was a huge transition between what was written and what was just shared verbally, with a lot of issues. Because if you, on one side, what is orally transmitted, in this sense we understand tradition with a capital T, okay? Something that is transmitted, transducted, shared, pushed forward. The issue is that, of course, things can change from one ear to the next one, or rather from one ear to someone else's mouth, and then to a third person ear. Okay, things can change. Another set of complicated issues might arise if we crystallize everything in one book, okay? Even more so if the book actually is printed, no longer handwritten, so you remove this part too, and that becomes crystallized in a way that it might not represent the vibration, fluctuation, poetic, creative power of the original one. And you don't have to think about just Gutenberg in this sense, but really everything becomes more structured. And I will make this comparison in a cognitive sense in neuroscience. If you think about what we said about morphing from fluid intelligence to crystallized intelligence, right? And it's part of human development. This is also true not on an individual level, not even a level of our species, but cross-culturally in space and time. Okay, we're morphing from a fluid type of intelligence, which by definition, at least to me, appears to be more holistic and integrated, to a more binary one. This is also connected to what we said about the distinction between symbolic and diabolic interpretation. If you remember, I mentioned this in many of my courses. Symbolic in Greek has to do with bringing things together. It's by definition a holistic view of the world, okay, where everything is a spectrum, okay? It's a rainbow, it's a spectrum of possibilities. And the diabolic, from diaballein, it's the more cognitive, logical, mathematical, binary way to interpret the world, right? Where one is true and the other is false. That's to do, of course, with the principle of falsifiability in science. And so we could also make the case that we learn on one side, but we either unlearn or become cognitively lazy on the other side. If you would like to find more about this, I would like to share some of the research in the context of positive and negative effects of exposure to media, utilization of electronic devices and screen time. Now, this is all wonderful, but the general idea is this. We have to take into account the passing of time and the spatial framework, the geocultural framework, when we talk about neuroscience, when we talk about medicine, when we talk about judgment, okay, clinical judgment, and cognitive taxonomies. Because otherwise, we might actually prone to make not the most commonly understood mistake that we simply forget about the cultural framework. Okay? We forget about minorities, for instance. We forget about the specific of this or that culture, but we actually assume that we are outside of time and space. We are the ultimate truth, and everything else is kind of folk medicine, folk neuroscience, folk psychology. You know, it's good for studies in anthropology, good for studying in history and archaeology, but it's not real science. We have the real science, okay? And that's a really, really big mistake. Something that I discuss in my courses in integrative medicine, and I will link those basic lectures below. But again, the main mistake we could possibly make in the context of critical neuroscience is not being critical enough about the way we do neuroscience. So let's continue.
And let's continue by making sure that we are indeed critical enough in neuroscience so that we don't make those mistakes that we mentioned last week in the previous one, particularly in regard to some stereotypical understanding of culture and community. Now, we did mention that community is a much more profound term in comparison to society. It's a term that is connected to ethnocultural factors, to spiritual factors, to cohesion, connection, and empathy. And we also discussed the importance of cultural understanding and in-group perception to create both healthy boundaries on one side, but also the sense of belonging, the sense of safety. And this is connected to the conceptualization of group, family, etc. Now, if you remember, we talked about this in the context of intelligence, and we mentioned the work by Hans-Jürgen Eysenck, specifically the publication Race, Intelligence, and Education, where Eysenck claimed that a variety of intellectual differences that are observable in our culture, and in general, much of the difference observed between certain racial groups depends to a great extent on genetic factors. So we're connecting that part to this week. And again, all these fields are connected: medical anthropology, social neuroscience, cultural neuroscience, the transcultural, transpersonal neuroscience are all deeply connected. And the same is true for ethnopharmacology, which focuses on the evaluation and application of plant derivatives, ethnopharmaceutics. and ethnobotany. Now, ethnopharmaceutics study the traditional methods and techniques of preparation of pharmaceutical form, while ethnobotany analyzes the production and delivery of pharmaceutical through traditional knowledge. Those are sometimes viewed as separate fields from an academic standpoint, but they all contribute to the multidisciplinary approach of ethnomedicine. And again, keep in mind the connection between terms such as populus, popular, the Latin, folk, Völkisch, the Germanic, and ethnos, the Greek counterpart. Now, of course, there are other sociological and philosophical components to this. We mentioned habitus and habitat last week. We could also mention another philosopher, Habermas, who discussed or divided two different types of culture. The first type, which is understood from a general perspective and it's not necessarily shared by all members of society. And then a second type, which is both common and political and marked by a shared respect for rights. Now, as we are looking at ourselves, at our Western culture, despite the fact that Western, it's a construct that doesn't really provide a lot of scientific evidence, as we previously stated, as we're looking at this, also as part of our group project, which will be one of the elements of this part of the semester, keep in mind that a lot of neuroscientific approaches to psychiatry, for instance, were in themselves part of a Western, specifically Anglo-Saxon, United-based perspective, a viewpoint on psychiatric disorders. You could also call this DSM-based disorders, such as schizophrenia, but also depression and personality disorders, because what we said last week about this concept of being eradicated, being estranged from one's culture, increases the rate of these mental health disorders. So we are really talking about an eradicated culture, a culture without roots. And this is better understood, as to say, in psychoanalytic terms, particularly if we think about Jung, C.J. Jung, Carl Gustav Jung, and his perspective of the archetype or the collective unconscious, an archetype where the subject can become a stranger in a strange land, in an estranged, foreign land. The concept here is Entfremdung in the German original. This aspect has social and socioeconomic outcomes, we would say, as in the opposition to Gattungswesen. This is a term, or in the sense coined by Feuerbach and Marx. But in this specific context, there are clinical anthropological references to the quote new cross-cultural psychiatry, the one by Kleinman. And again, this cross-cultural element means that there is a crossing borders conceptualization here, which again connects us to some of the works by Lévinas, for instance, the relation between the I and the other. There is a movement from the I, from myself, or the personal I, the I think, the me, the objective me, which is observed and observable. So this movement of the personal I, is towards the other, towards as in confrontation, mutual exchange. In Italian we would say in confronto a. And again, keep in mind that frontis in Latin is connected to the prefrontal cortex. So there is a cognitive component there, but it's also an incontro scontro. It's an encounter-based experience, which is founding from the cognitive perspective, but also an existential struggle, a battle. This is what Lévinas defined as the other, as in other from me, which is represented by the face of the other, but also a face in general. Now, this is absolutely fundamental from the perspective of neuroscience. In neuroscience and pain, existential pain, because it has to do with empathy. from a neural correlate perspective, and I'm thinking of the research on empathy and mirror neurons, but also from a spiritual perspective. Because the consequential relationship between myself and the other person is a conceptual and spiritual image. It's a presentation and representation. It's an epiphany of my neighbor, the neighbor as a concept. Now, this neighbor is, of course, the other me, my peer, my correlative. And I rely on him, on this neighbor, for support of myself, of my identity, of my life, and meaning, which really is connected to a divine dimension of the other, which in itself has to do with a call for personal responsibility, a movement outside ourselves, a movement toward making sure that the other is taken care of. It's a very altruistic movement, service to this neighbor. My neighbor is myself. By helping my neighbor, I am helping myself. This, of course, has to do with a religious dimension, the dimension of God that does not act directly, but via the face of the other. A God who, or a God that, and I would really emphasize the personal component here, because we're talking about the otherness, so the embodiment of God in the otherness, a personalization here, a God who has implanted, as Dimitrova wrote, God who has implanted in us a spark of reason, and no matter how much we try to step on it and extinguish it, that is impossible. Now, this is fundamental, not just because it entirely demolishes any possible clash between a spiritual religious sense of human existence or existence in general and a scientific one, but also because it provides evidence for the fact that we are combining these two things, not because we want to simplify things, but because that's exactly how our life works in the most effective way. It's the most effective way to interpret life and also to live it. Now, this actually provides a clear understanding of biology, evolutionary biology especially, because it gives a completely new understanding, which is really a mind-body connection type of understanding. It's understanding that it is not about the survival of the fetus alone, in a sense that this is an oversimplistic notion of what biology is, because again, it's a judgment outside of it, and it's a poorly constructed judgment, but it has more to do with the fact that we are meant for each other as human beings. This connection, this spark of reason that Dimitrova talks about in regard to Lévinas, commits us to a search for justice inspired by charity based on this personal relation with the other than me, a relationship which is divine in nature and cannot be destroyed. This is connected to sheer biology, the biology of meaning. In this sense, I really recommend students that are interested in the soul, mind, and personhood in modern biology to watch some lectures by Professor Stephen Meredith. I will link some of this lecture below this video. Now, I would like to add something more, again, from this strictly neurobiological perspective, that this connection with the other, this understanding myself by facing the other person face, this connection, it's something that has to do with me observing, seeing the other really. And some of the research that has been conducted in connection to this concept is the one of the visual, spatial, and object processing areas in the brain to investigate whether the perception of details versus broader views, or direct versus indirect gaze, especially between human subjects in a social environment, could be linked to geocultural differences. Now, keep in mind what we said in week, I believe, 1 through 3 on neural underpinnings of perception and basic neuroanatomy, specifically lateral hemispherical differences, where the right hemisphere has this more big picture type of perception, and the left hemisphere as the more analytical, detailed half of the brain, part of the brain. Now, the neuroscientific analysis covers regions such as the bilateral middle temporal gyrus, the left superior parietal gyrus, and the right superior temporal gyrus, and compares their activities to processing and activation levels in the limbic system. Now, what I want to convey here is that inferring that the above-mentioned areas are more or less activated in the execution of specific tasks, such as watching people exchanging verbal conversation or simply gazing at the person's face directly, implies the activation of more cognitive interpretative areas and a deeper level of cognitive appraisal and judgment, which is possibly the primary effector of the sociocultural component at hand. The sociocultural component, of course, understood as cognitive frameworks. Now, this is yet again another area where mind and body come together, where philosophy, spirituality, and empirical science come together, because in mental health disorders, this disorder is also a disorder in perceptual modality, in emotional modalities. In other words, individuals that are suffering from, let's say, depression are presenting mistakes, I dare to use this term, this judgment, errors in the way they perceive, they experience, they feel reality. Now, reality in this context has to do with our perception of the world, of existence in itself, with consciousness. Now, if you think about Hegel, we mentioned this German philosopher in the context of the Phenomenology of spirit a few weeks ago. He believed, for instance, that nerves were communicating patterns of consciousness, allowing impulses to be delivered throughout the system, while the brain and the spinal cord, which in modern time we define as CNS, as the central nervous system, were the immediate presence of self-consciousness, a presence self-contained, not an object, and also not transient. Now, this is connected to social neuroscience, to the connection between our perception, our emotions, and society. Again, this otherness. From this perspective, the social neurological perspective, the activity of this consciousness is to be found in the activation of this system where, in society, in the social context, starting from ourselves, our core social element, our community, but even before that, starting from the family, which is where the child develops the self in stages, including ethical stages and cognitive stages. Now, another thing I want to mention, because we just quoted Hegel here, is the conceptualization of marriage. Okay, this union. Marriage, according to Hegel, matrimony, we would say in the correct term, marriage is where male and female, these two opposites, both antithetic, and keep in mind Hegel and synthesis from not in a consequential way, of course, thesis and antithesis. So marriage is where male and female, both antithetic, join in synthetic union and produce offspring to carry on the family estate in this specific sense. Now, where the female is the domain of divine law, according to Hegel, the male is the domain of human law. So what is the synthesis? The synthesis is a practical ethic which expands to include the whole community. So this is truly important, because we're starting from our neurons, our neural underpinnings of behavior. We verify biological sequencing mechanism, and we arrive at the connection between development, family, society, and community, which is evident and observable in these experience-dependent neuromaturational processes, developmental processes, which contribute to the maturation in childhood and adolescence. Now, again, this is quite a complex topic to study. Hegel in itself, it's very, very difficult. So I'm not expecting students to master all the terms connected to Hegelian philosophy as presented in this chapter. I'm doing my best to summarize the most important part in this lecture so that you will have a sound grasp also in preparation for the assignments in this course. Maybe few terms that I would like to mention here. And again, don't worry about remembering everything in this part. Since we're talking about Hegel and we talked about the phenomenology of the spirit, the life of the spirits, I want to specify that for this absolute spirit to be there, the Dasein, be there, this contingent component, the consciousness form, this consciousness has to take different forms. It has to understand their forthcoming and remorph, change into a different shape in order to see itself. Again, this ability to see myself, my consciousness sees itself from the outside. Hegel would say als Ende und Anfang, as the end and the beginning. However, through the way of despair, this is an existential component. The way of despair in the original is the Weg der Verzweiflung. And I really want to stress this. I briefly mentioned the etymology of Verzweiflung. Verzweiflung is desperation because it's to do with internal split. We are in desperation. We are suffering as human beings because we are internally split. If you remember our conversation on the stages, from cognitive distortions all the way to paranoid ideation and psychosis, we are dissociative feature, we are internally split. And we are split if you are separate, where there's two pairs, we are despaired, Verzweiflung in German, zwei Fälle, two cases. We are at a crossroad. We are unable to see the end of the road, and we don't know which road to take. Now, I'm very passionate about this because I really value the concept of balance, of understanding, of feeling rooted, of feeling that we belong, which is the opposite of being in desperation, having two cases, two opposite roads. Everything is integrated when we feel healthy, when our emotions and our thoughts are working properly, when we feel loved, when we feel understood. However, these two cases, these two separations, can also be understood from the perspective of science. Think about what we said about the principle of falsifiability, the scientific method, right? That yes or no, these two ways, 0 and 1. Now, in this chapter, I mentioned a presentation, a basic principle of data analysis and research methods connecting to this principle of falsifiability. To give an example here, I think of the doctrine of multi-level analysis by Cacioppo and Berntson, which is based on three main elements. And again, you find this in the textbook. These three elements are multiple preceding condition, antecedents, 2, non-additive determinism, and 3, reciprocal determinism. In the first case, a target event on a structural level can have different triggers, either within this level or across multiple levels. In the second case, the properties of the whole are not necessarily predictable from the properties of the constituents. And in the third element, there is a reciprocal influence between biological and social factors with regard to the development of the target behavior. Now, this is extremely interesting because it connects this mathematical scientific analysis to the social context, which is exactly what we are trying to do here, moving from week 9 through this week 10 and toward next week 11 and 12, where we will talk even more about perception, because in a course on mind-body connection, we have to display, or rather be able to perceive the display of the connection outwardly as well. Now, while Cacioppo and Berntson are considered the pioneers, the founding fathers of social neuroscience, Cacioppo also worked with Jean Decety to better define the best research approaches in the field of social neuroscience. Now, they call this the golden triangle of human neurosciences. And this golden triangle includes 1, behavioral data, for instance, response time, choice and judgment; 2, physiological measurements, neuroimaging techniques providing correlative data of the human brain; and 3, animal model and human experiments, including lesion studies, experimental pharmacology, transcranial magnetic stimulation. And in this case, the experimental investigations allow causal inference. Now, of course, if social neuroscience investigated the relationship between society and the brain, the interaction between culture and the brain is the main focus of neuroanthropology, which is connected, of course, to medical anthropology. So these two disciplines are closely connected to the point that their descriptors, their labels are often used as synonyms. And of course, there are connections with other fields, such as sociobiology. Sociobiology contributed to the creation of yet another synthesis, the synthesis of the whole social behavior, this time understood as the activity of a genotype directly influencing the phenotype on the basis of nature and in adaptive sense. So in this context, we can think of this connection, parallel connection between gene and meme in the context of social media, for instance. Now, given that according to sociobiologists, even social behavior is a phenotype, it is in its very nature linked to the interaction between the environment and the genotype, and it's therefore following natural selection in a neo-Darwinian sense. Now, this interaction between this environment creates a form of pressure interpreted as a selective social expectation on the individual or the group. Now, of course, this in itself can be criticized because despite the fact that it argues against a teleological component you can find in spiritual religious practices where life itself has a direction and a meaning, a direction that cannot necessarily be or should not be necessarily described as a continuous linear historical sequence. This might be more true in the context of the Judeo-Christian and Islamic world, where history is in a linear structure, as opposed to theories of the eternal return, this continuous cycle. But nevertheless has a teleological component. There's a direction and meaning, so it can be criticized because it's against this, and yet it substitutes one teleological argument for another one. And of course, there are other criticisms. For instance, thinking about Stephen Jay Gould, argued that specific traits in human behavior could be literally passed on via cultural influence, but there are also other perspectives that include a broader definition of culture. For instance, the effects of tradition on human action and ideation. Now, tradition is such an important term because it has to do with carrying over, with a transient aspect, with a continuous movement. And again, I would like to go back to this movement from myself to the other through space and time. So it's a tradition with a capital T. For students that are interested in this specific type of tradition, of course, the author's list is never ending and it touches upon perennial philosophy. So we could mention many authors, Mircea Eliade, for instance, Elémire Zolla, we could mention René Guénon, many others. So sociobiologists reply that to all this criticism, they reply that natural selection plays a much bigger role in the development of all these aspects, and even if some behaviors are only in part inherited through genetic transmission, behavioral traits can be passed on to the next generation following the same rules found in general biology, such as reproduction and preservation of a specific gene in the population. And yet again, according to evolutionary fitness and adaptation, which is to some extent what psychobiology or biopsychology claim. And yet this assumption is a teleological one. It's an assumption of meaning that is fairly enough a granted opinion, but it remains such unless you can find ways to demonstrate it outside of this evolutionary theory itself. And again, this criticism from the outset is essential because we are indeed reaching a point in science where we can actually customize this evolutionary biological process. And the question asked in the textbook, the question I'm asking you is, what would happen if we could decide how to, quote, nurture nature? We always talk about the nurture-nature debate, but this is always a nurture versus nature, a nurture in front of nature, mirroring nature, confronting nature, dialoguing with nature, having a conversation with nature. But what if we use nurture as a verb and nature as a direct object? What if we could decide how to nurture nature? we're referring to the discoveries and application of the genome editing technology known as CRISPR-Cas9, which the technology was first constructed by the team of the Japanese molecular biologist Yoshizumi Shino, and then more recently by the laboratory of Shukra Mitalipov, the Kazakh biologist, currently director of the Center for Embryonic Cell and Gene Therapy at Oregon Health and Science University. Now, CRISPR stands for Cluster Regularly Interspace Short Palindromic Repeats and represents repetitive palindromic patterns of prokaryotic DNA, more specifically cascade complex genes, followed by a leader sequence, and finally by a repeat spacer array, which allows these proteins to identify, isolate, and cut off exogenous DNA. Now, in the last version of CRISPR, scientists have finally reached the ability to genetically intervene in the modification of cellular structure for the purpose of correcting. And again, this correction has a judgmental component, which doesn't have to be a negative thing, but since it's judgment, what we're talking about, it has to be outside of the process itself. Now, so this modification of cellular structure are created for the purpose of correcting pathogenic gene mutations, for instance, at the level of human embryos, or to repair or edit specific genetic sequences through the insertion of other DNA pattern. And again, we could sum up all of this from a very judgmental standpoint, as in talking about science, just because we are able to do something, just because we can do something, it does not follow necessarily that we ought to do something or that we should do something. Now, this might sound quite moralizing, just taken as such, but it's really important to understand that since we're talking about criticism, a critical neuroscientific component, when we are applying any type of technology, we are, first of all, identifying only one type of knowledge. Going back to Aristotle, right? The three types of knowledge, technology is one of these three. And also, we are making a judgment that is outside of science itself.
This is the end of week 10. Congratulations. We were able to complete chapter 5, and we will venture into one of the most complex parts of this course. Next week, week 11, and the following one, week 12, we will talk about perception and cognition. So, as I previously mentioned, this is one of the most difficult topics in this course, not because everything else we discussed so far was easy and less complex, but just because the level of memorization in the following 2 weeks might be slightly higher, which does not mean that I will ask every single topic we will discuss in the next 2 weeks in the quiz, but I would like you to at least slow down a little bit to understand all the theoretical framework, the mathematical construct, the equations, and the logical processes involved in perception and cognition. Is one of the longest chapters in the textbook, and so there's really no rush, no panic. I just want to give you a heads up because it can be slightly different in pace and also in the overall structure of the lecture. You will see less and less of me and more calculations and equations to discuss these topics. Thank you very much again. We concluded chapter 5, so we will move on to chapter 6 next week. Bye bye.